Hey y'all, I'm Natalie Chevalier, the Civic and Volunteer Programs Manager at Activate Good. If you volunteered back in the summer to help collect all of this data, then you may have been talking to me. I just wanted to say thank you again for everyone involved. We wouldn't have been able to pull this off without everyone who was so interested in engaging and, walking around, riding your bike, driving with a sensor in order to collect information. So we had over 160 volunteer citizen scientists. So I just want to shout out to y'all for participating. And if you have any other ways that you want to be involved in the community, just shout out to Activate Good and we will get you all matched up. Back to you, Max.
Hey, thanks, Natalie. Appreciate you. I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Imani Vincent, to get us started today. Imani, take it away.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Raleigh Durham HeatWatch data release. My name is Imani Vincent. I'm an education fellow at the Museum of Life and Science. Truly glad to be here tonight to discuss and make pivotal information available for the public about the urban heat in the Durham-Raleigh area. But before we move forward, I want to take this time to give thanks and acknowledgements to people who make our community. First, I want to say happy Black History Month to everyone here in the call. And also, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Ino, the Tutelo, the Saponi, the Ukaniche, and then the Shea-Kori Native people. And Max will post the Tutelo translation in the chat. And this translation was generously brought to us by Vicky Jeffries. So like Natalie mentioned, we want to take a big time thanking all the 160 people who collected data as part of this project, and dozens more who contributed to the route design, submitting points of interest for the data sampling, refined our methodology, and helped to beta test with us. Some drove around in their car with heat sensors mounted to them, and some walked or biked for hours. And because of your dedication and time that day, we collected over 100,000 data points, which our model shows tonight. However, we have 10,000 more data points that we need to analyze. So there, from our walking data, so there is still more to come with this project. You took it upon yourselves to get active in your community, and by doing so, helped organizations fabricate heat maps on one of our record hottest days of the summer. Your love for the community led us to this moment and hopefully towards seeing active change for the present and future. So thank you, and we truly do appreciate it. So you've heard me say community a lot in this short amount of time I've been speaking, but I simply think we wouldn't be here without the power of it. While I worked at a family homeless shelter, we participated in beta testing with the organization. We analyzed data points we had, and we made our own conclusions on that day. I knew this collaboration would build trust between teams and an organization actively working towards change in the community. So it made participation even more exciting for them. And the teams were given the opportunity to be scientists and collect data points that ultimately led us to better understanding heat in downtown Durham. So the connections that they made, they made connections with the things they experience daily and the current infrastructure around them, and it was truly amazing. This was possible simply by having resources available and accessible to people. So remember that citizen science, the voices of the community are just as valid as the experts. So tonight, the webinar will flow as presented on the screen. And now I will hand it over to my colleague, Max.
Hey, thanks so much, Imani. So like Imani said, this was really a massive team effort. You'll see here a bunch of the core project partners that really brought this project together. Along with this team, you see here on the screen, there are a number of other individuals and organizations that came together to make this project possible. And that includes the Hayti Heritage Center, UNC Carolina Climate and Health Alliance, Data Driven Lab, Ellerby Creek Watershed Association, Bragtown Neighborhood Association, North Carolina Clinicians for Climate Action, Merrick Moore Community Development Corporation, Trees Durham, Clean Air North Carolina, Extraterrestrial Projects, DataWorks NC, and a whole bunch more that we simply just don't have enough time to go over. But really from the bottom of our hearts, thank you all so much for making this project possible. It's likely that most of us have gathered here this evening to see the geographic distribution of heat across Raleigh and Durham. which are the results of this summer's campaign. Now, these incredibly important data are indeed one of the big headlines from this evening that we all ought to take seriously and reckon with in this program and afterwards. On a warm day, July 23rd of this past summer, about 160 people showed up to a few parking lots across Raleigh and Durham to walk, drive, and bike heat sensors around for an hour at a time. This happened 3 times that day, once early in the morning, once in the afternoon, and once in the early evening, which gave us the ability to see what heat looks and feels like across an entire day in our region. Due at least in part to a different climate hazard, wildfire smoke pouring in from the western United States, rather than gathering data during a heat wave, we instead somewhat serendipitously have insight into what our partners at the National Weather Service might classify as a pretty typical late July day here, with a pretty typical high of around 89 degrees. This is about what we might expect to find on any random day here in July. It is indeed then pretty remarkable finding that even on a typical day, we find a maximum model difference of around 10.4 degrees Fahrenheit between areas a matter of miles away from each other. Rather than finding that urban areas are simply doomed to be warmer than their suburban or rural counterparts, complex urban dynamics make some areas significantly warmer and some places cooler within relatively close proximity to one another. So one of the headlines may be that even on a typical heat day in Raleigh and Durham, we saw a 10.4 degree model difference between the hottest and coolest parts of our cities. This is a difference likely only to increase in disparity when we see hotter days or genuine heat waves. But I hope we'll also pause and reflect on this takeaway. Science is an ongoing process that is always done by people. This project, this science, is also ongoing. Finding results that show with great confidence the geographic distribution of heat is indeed an important feat, but it's also only a first of many steps in reckoning with and rectifying this circumstance. Indeed, another one of the headlines from tonight will be that the heat expression across Raleigh and Durham and the disproportionate burden of heat are not random. They are an echo, a reflection of a painful legacy of racist and exclusionary policy and planning decisions and bad decision making. These public data made with and by people, residents themselves of Raleigh and Durham, are a starting point for making better decisions in the future. These data do not exist in a vacuum, and useful, rigorous, and scientifically defensible data that residents collected will have important applications. It's also important to consider that as we consider this geographic distribution tonight, as we look at these models and maps in the future, that it is also people who fundamentally experience and are put at risk by heat. The act of collecting these data, of contributing to this project, of joining this webinar tonight is an act of care and commitment and love to your community and the people in it. We should commit again tonight for caring with and for people put at risk and in harm's way by fundamentally unjust systems that require we rethink and re-examine the way we build, develop, and live. For your work in creating these data, you have our sincere gratitude and thanks. For this project would not have happened, and this new knowledge would remain unknown without you. For your continued care about heat, you have our commitment to take these seriously, to help you use them, to figure out how best to disseminate them, and to get them into the hands of those who need them and those who need to consider them. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Vivek Chandas, and Vivek can tell us a little bit about how these data were analyzed and modeled. Vivek, take it away.
Thank you, Max, and thanks to the whole team that's come together today. My name is Vivek Chandas. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm coming to you with people in mind, the people whose ancestral lands I'm standing on, and who currently also occupy this land, the Multnomah, the Clackamas, the Tumwater, the Lalabans of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous communities that have lived alongside of a river known as Wimla, Nichawana, or Columbia. I'm really honored to be here because if they're having done over 50 of these campaigns where we have really trying to do 2 things. One is to describe the patterns. This is where science really comes in, describing the patterns. And then the second part of asking the question of why do these patterns exist? And so Max really teed it up well in thinking about centering people at the core of this endeavor. And if I had an award to give the Raleigh-Durham team, it would definitely be one of the most engaged, people-centered awards that I have seen in the over 50 campaigns that I've done. 165 folks coming together and being able to mount sensors, go out and really integrate not only the science, but then the community engagement part of it. This is truly kind of the spirit around which these campaigns were designed a decade ago. And you all just did it such an incredible job in bringing all this together. And I'm just want to share a few minutes here about how these specific data come together. What we do is we take all of the data sets that you have collected. You collected almost 100,000 individual temperature and humidity points on that day in July 23rd, 2021, and across 19 routes in the Raleigh-Durham areas. And what we essentially are able to do with that is take those data, and in the areas where you didn't go, we're able to use what essentially is short of a computer algorithm and machine learning process to say what was on that spot and what around it helps to predict that temperature. So if you're driving by a park, for example, and there's a specific temperature that's measured, we're able to use satellite imagery to say that that specific point and location has a park around it, and what is that, how much of that temperature is predicted or attributable to that park. And so as a result of that kind of association, we can start putting data into areas where you didn't actually drive or didn't actually walk. And it becomes what Max was referencing as a surface of modeling that allows us, that uses modeling, computer modeling, that allows us to develop a continuous description of temperature on a specific typical warm late July day in Raleigh and Durham. So that's really at the core of this. We do a lot of data quality control, quality assessment, and develop these maps. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. There are also several papers, some technical and some not so technical, that I'm happy to share with you if you want to dig into this work. Again, I'm here for supporting this effort and wanting to go from this first step of describing these patterns to the second step of why do we see these patterns here, what went on in these locations, and to integrate that into your lived experience of each of the places that we're able to describe these data sets around. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to Max.
Hey, Vivek, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate you. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Miley Neal from the State Climate Office of North Carolina. Miley, take it away.
Thanks, Max. I'm going to share my screen quickly, so give me 1 second. All right. So good evening, everybody. My name is Miley Neal. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from the State Climate Office of North Carolina, as Max said. I want to start out with just a quick explanation on what the urban heat island effect is, and then I'll get into the data that we collected that shows what this effect looks like in Raleigh and Durham. So the term urban heat island refers to the fact that metropolitan areas tend to get much warmer than their outlying regions, especially during the summer. And in a heat island, temperatures on hot days can be amplified by paved and dark surfaces like roads, parking lots, and buildings. These surfaces absorb and retain heat during the day, and then they radiate that heat back into the air. And this drives a significant increase in air temperature and heat index in certain areas within a city, which can get much hotter than green areas that have more trees and shade. And there are a number of reasons for this. In more populated areas, there are more human-caused heat emissions, like from transportation and the heating and cooling of buildings. And areas that have less vegetation, that results in those areas having less evaporative cooling, which is a natural cooling effect that plants have on the air surrounding them. So contrary to the name of the term urban heat island, this effect is not necessarily confined to only, say, urban versus rural areas, but it's more so due to the differences in land use between those different areas. And we'll see that coming up here in the data. So in other areas of the country, some neighborhoods have been shown to get up to 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than other neighborhoods within the same city. And while you're not going to see that big of a difference consistently, since those are peaks, our goal with this project was mapping this effect within Raleigh and Durham, in part to see how vast the temperature differences are between different areas within our cities. So here are some highlights of the data that we collected on our campaign day. As it's been mentioned before, our volunteers recorded just over 99,000 measurements over the course of the day. And on the day of the campaign, the maximum temperature that our volunteers recorded was 88.8 degrees Fahrenheit. This was on the afternoon traverse in Raleigh. The maximum temperature recorded in Durham was right up there too at 88.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And the maximum heat index was 93.5 degrees, which, like the high temperatures for the day, also occurred in the afternoon. Urban heat island intensity indicates the temperature difference between the hottest and coolest temperatures in the city on the same day at the same time. A study done by Climate Central last year estimated that the average heat island intensity in the Raleigh-Durham area was about 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And they based that on factors such as land cover and population density. And then through the Urban Heat Island Mapping Project, we were actually able to measure that directly. So what we found was that the largest temperature differential was 10.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was recorded on the evening traverse in Durham. The largest temperature differential in Raleigh was just under that at 9.6 degrees difference. And as Max mentioned earlier, it wasn't the absolute hottest day of the summer because we had some wildfire smoke up in the atmosphere coming in from fires out west that shielded some of that solar radiation coming in. And the surface temperatures didn't get quite as hot as they were forecasted to be that day. But keeping that in mind, we still got some pretty significant temperature and heat index differences between the different parts of Raleigh and Durham. And we know that these differences will be amplified even further on a hotter day where the high might be in the 90s. So let's take a look at where the most significant temperature differences are between different areas of our cities. So we started off the morning with traverses between 6 and 7 a.m. And the sun was just coming up as these temperatures were being measured. The sunrise on this day was at 6:16 a.m. So the temperature differential between the warmest and coolest areas of the city at this time was 6.6 degrees in Raleigh and 6.3 degrees in Durham. The warmest temperature measured in Raleigh that morning was 71.9 degrees, and the warmest temperature measured in Durham that morning was 70.7 degrees. So that gives you sort of a baseline about what sort of temperatures we started out the day with. And you'll notice that the areas that are already starting out warmer than their surroundings are the downtown areas and the highest density developed areas in both cities. So for Durham, as you can see, that's right along the Durham Freeway, 147. And for Raleigh, it's up along Capitol Boulevard and westward from downtown out towards NC State and the fairgrounds and PNC Arena. So advancing forward to the afternoon, you'll notice that the broad areas of heating that we saw in the morning have now started to break up into areas of much finer resolution. And you can start to see some pretty defined differences between the areas of the cities. The temperature differential between the warmest and coolest areas in Raleigh has gone from 6.6 degrees in the morning to now 8.7 degrees in the afternoon. And in Durham, it has gone from 6.3 degrees up to now 8.5 degrees of a difference. And at this point, we have our maximum recorded temperatures, our high temperatures for the day, which we measured at 88.8 degrees Fahrenheit in Raleigh and 88.6 degrees Fahrenheit in Durham. The hottest areas of the cities are really standing out in these afternoon maps. And in Durham, we see the campus of North Carolina Central University that's really standing out, as well as the Northgate Mall area. And then in Raleigh, downtown again is standing out, as well as the fairgrounds and the rest of that area where Blue Ridge Road meets Hillsborough Street. So this is the same map of the afternoon temperatures in Raleigh, but I've zoomed in here a little bit to downtown and the surrounding areas, which is a pretty good example of an area where you have some dark reds and dark blues that are not that far from each other. So just an example here of how land cover can affect these temperatures. I've pulled some satellite imagery of one of the hottest areas and one of the coolest areas shown here. And so here we have a snapshot of downtown on the right, and then we have a snapshot of an area out near Lake Raleigh over on the left. The downtown temperatures are up around 86 to 87 degrees maximum, and the temperatures in the blue area are around 82 degrees. So you can see pretty clearly here that the difference between these two areas is all of the development, the buildings, the pavement downtown, in contrast to the trees and the greenery out near Lake Raleigh. And one interesting feature that I noticed is there's this tiny orange hole in the middle of a dark red downtown Raleigh. And that's actually one square block, which is Nash Square. And if you're familiar with that area, you'll know that it has a ton of trees just in that one square block. And you can really see the cooling effect of those trees very clearly here. So this is a satellite imagery of what it looks like. And if you had been standing in that one square block with trees that afternoon, you would have been standing in about 85 degree heat. But if you walked just one block over, you would have been standing in 86 or 87 degree heat. And that's a difference of 1 or 2 degrees just by walking across the street. So moving on through time to the evening. This was the time period that we saw the largest temperature differences between neighborhoods. And although it wasn't quite as warm as the afternoon, the areas with less extreme heating started cooling down in the evening. Either they started cooling earlier or faster than the hotter areas did. So the extremely hot areas were still fairly hot at this time, while the less hot areas were already starting to cool down, which led to the largest temperature differentials of the day, which was 9.6 degrees for Raleigh and 10.4 degrees for Durham. So not only did we measure air temperature, but we measured humidity as well, which allowed us to calculate heat index. And heat index is more like what we feel, especially since the humidity can get pretty high out here in North Carolina in the summer. So I won't go through all of the heat index maps for every time period, but I'm going to show this one. On the left is the afternoon temperature map for Durham, and then on the right is a map of heat index values for the same time period. And you can really see the difference in these maps, like especially where the heat index just spikes in certain areas. And I'm going to zoom in here to that area, that southwest area in Durham. Let's see. So where you're seeing the warmer temperatures here is an area where there are a lot of buildings and parking lots, and that area is about 85 degrees. And right alongside it is a cooler, greener residential neighborhood that's only about 82 degrees. So that's a 3-degree difference, and that's a pretty significant temperature difference just being like having these two areas just right across the street from each other. But if you take a look at the heat index map, the warmer area has a heat index of 89 degrees, and the cooler area right next to it only has a heat index of 83 degrees. So factoring in this humidity and what it actually feels like to the human body when you go outside, there is a 6-degree difference just by walking across the street. That is an incredible difference. So humidity makes hot areas feel a lot hotter, but it doesn't have as much of an impact on cooler areas. So the impact of humidity on what the heat can feel like outside really exacerbates the urban heat island effect significantly. So looking at these maps, it's important to understand that extreme heat is not distributed evenly or equitably across environments. Urban heat islands are one of the ways that we most directly see racist policy and planning playing out as climate risk and hazard today. And how a person experiences extreme heat varies tremendously based on where they live and the conditions that they live in. And this is tied directly to the decisions that people in power have made in the past. These decisions include the racial segregation of cities, like through the Homeowners Loan Corporation or the HOLC, that divided up cities into color-graded zones based on racial demographics. The history of white supremacy in decision-making meant that these redlined areas, which were deemed less desirable because they had more Black and brown people living in them, did not receive equitable investment. And this included investment in the same things that we now understand to be important mitigations against climate hazards, including extreme heat. This history of decision-making is played out so that many of these formerly redlined neighborhoods, rather than being left in the past, they are today still lacking the type of investment that helps build resilience to extreme heat. So here's an example of the effects that formerly redlined neighborhoods are still feeling today. On the left, you'll see the neighborhoods that were historically green line, indicating the areas that were deemed the best by the HOLC. And on the right, you'll see the neighborhoods that were historically redlined. So there's a clear temperature difference between these areas today because of those decisions that were made in the past. So when we talk about extreme heat, it's not only a climate issue, but it's also a social and economic justice issue as well. Okay, so putting all of this into a broader context, globally, the year 2021 ranked as the 6th hottest year on record, and the top 10 hottest years on record have all occurred within the last 12 years. So on top of the global effects of a warming climate, local urban heat islands can exacerbate the impact of the heat, and they can create a higher health risk for vulnerable populations. So what about North Carolina specifically? This is a screenshot from the climate trends plotter on the State Climate Office website. Temperatures in North Carolina have warmed over the historical past about 1 degree Fahrenheit over the last century. And this map shows an increase in daily maximum temperature at United States Historical Climate Network stations across the Southeast. The red dots indicate warming since 1950, and the size of the dot corresponds to the magnitude of the trend. So while we've seen an increase in maximum or daily high temperatures, we see an even bigger increase in warm nights or minimum temperatures. And as you'll notice, the red dots here are larger in size, indicating more significance. There's been a consistent warming trend in minimum temperatures across the entire Southeast United States. So while we expect nights to be a bit cooler than the daytime, these warm temperatures do present a public health risk, especially in the hotter parts of our cities. There are increased risks to vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, children, people who work outdoors. There are increased risks to people who might not have adequate air conditioning in order to cool their homes. So with heat impacts being so unevenly distributed, it's important that we understand where the hotter parts of our cities are, since rising temperatures will lead to even more heat impacts within urban heat islands. So before I pass it off to our partners in Durham and Raleigh, I want to show where you can find more information and access and download the data. So at the top of the slide here is the link to the North Carolina State Climate Office website and the Urban Heat Island project page. If you go to that link, you'll find information about the project as well as links to download the data. Included in those downloads, we have a PDF of the Raleigh and Durham HeatWatch project report that Kappa Strategies provided to us, if you'd like to check that out. And we also have a couple of data downloads. So feel free to download those, take a look at them if you'd like. There are a lot of different data sets out there that you can compare these to and get some really interesting information out of. So that's all from me. I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass it on. We have some amazing representatives from Durham and Raleigh that will talk about what they plan on doing with the data. So I will pass it off to them.
Thank you so much. And as you're listening along, if you had any questions for anybody that's spoken so far or for Tobin and I as we go, please go ahead and put those in the question and answer box and we can start looking at those to talk after this. So I'm Megan Anderson. I head up sustainability for the city of Raleigh, and I'm joined by my partner in crime over in Durham County, who leads sustainability as well. We put our information there. We have some websites up to start talking about our urban heat work. So you can go ahead and check those out on our websites to get started. And we're going to share a little bit more. So next slide, please. So local governments across the country and world are working in their communities on climate change, as you hear all the time. And Raleigh and Durham have climate action plans that help us guide our work. And as you've been hearing, heat mitigation work is a really important part of our work to combat climate change. Governments are working, looking for ways to lead the way and work with our communities. And however, we're only a small piece of that puzzle in climate action work. And so with this topic and many others we talk about with climate action, we really need to talk about collective action and to make an impact. So we really wanted to just start out today to say this is a call for climate action across our communities, whether you're a homeowner, a family, a small business owner, a corporation, a nonprofit, or a government. We really need to think about how we can make impact together on these important topics like mitigating heat and protecting the community, and what we can do. So Tobin and I are going to share a few examples today on what local governments are thinking about and doing. And we'd also like for you to think about what you can do in your daily lives and where you work and where you play to help mitigate heat and protect yourself and your neighbors. So extreme heat is one of the top climate change stressors in our region, as Miley was sharing. It's also important to note that some folks in our community are more vulnerable to climate impacts. And unfortunately, it's often the case that those that contribute the least to climate change are those that are most affected by climate impacts. So with that in mind, we really need to think about how we can create strategies that will protect those in our community who are most sensitive to heat, knowing that cities can have up to a 20-degree difference, as Miley was mentioning, on a hot day. So those working outside, living without access to air conditioning, those are at high risk for health outcomes, will be more impacted by extreme heat. The good news is there are a lot of strategies we can implement to mitigate heat. Some of them are probably obvious, but others you may not have thought about before. These strategies also have many other important benefits to our community, and we'll share some ideas and examples today for all of us to think about. So now I'll hand it over to Tobin to share a few ideas on what types of questions we can all be asking ourselves that will help us protect ourselves and the community from heat.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to all the other panelists and partners and volunteers. It's really been great to be part of this, working with such wonderful people. So this slide shows several questions, and really, as you've heard already tonight, this is just the beginning of this. We don't have all the answers yet. We are looking forward to working with all of you to figure out what the answers are. And that those answers will vary from location to location and depending on who's in those communities and how they're impacted. But looking at the data, these are the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking and hope, excuse me, that you ask too about where is this heat? That was the whole point of this mapping. Are there areas that are hotter than others? Of course there are. Are there areas that take longer to cool off? Who are the people who are most impacted, as Megan was just saying? Where is the green infrastructure, the trees and the parks? We saw a really great example of that Miley showed. That really does have an impact. Are they equally dispersed? Are they in the areas they need to be to protect particular populations? What structures and types of design, excuse me, features are associated with those higher or lower temperatures? We saw that by being able to map a wide variety of land uses. And then as we're planning our communities, how do we try to have buildings and structures and urban design that will help to mitigate heat island? And a lot of us are talking about density. We're talking about trying to increase the number of people living and working in smaller areas so that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation and have livable communities and have more housing choices available for people. How do we do that in a way that also still preserves that open space and still reduces the urban heat island? So these, again, are not just questions that we're asking. We want everyone to have this dialogue. Next slide, please. And just a little to be clear, we talk about mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation is trying to reduce the effects of climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also reduce urban heat island. And we do that in a lot of different ways. These are some examples: the smart surfaces with shading from trees or other shade structure. Again, the urban design, splash parks, things like that. Adaptation is recognizing that there will be climate change. Even if we stopped emitting right now, we're still going to see the effects of that for some time, and that there will be urban heat island. And how do we adapt so that people and our infrastructure can best withstand and be resilient to that heat? And that's with cooling centers or assistance for people to have cooling in their own homes, having neighbor networks where people are checking in on each other on really hot days or for long periods of time, putting in place cooling ordinances that require providing cooling to renters, things like that. So we're looking at both of those aspects, both the mitigation to reduce the urban heat island, as well as how do we deal with the heating that we are already seeing and will continue to see.
All right, thank you, Tobin. So Tobin just mentioned smart surfaces, and I thought that this was a good slide to share that showed some examples of what a smart surface might be. So I mentioned earlier that we'd be sharing the examples for heat mitigation, and these also show some of those various co-benefits that we can have in our community. So just to mention a few, the design of our surfaces is an important way to mitigate heat. So surfaces that are light colored, they reflect off a lot of the light and heat. Just having a white or light colored roof can greatly reduce the amount of energy from the sun that's absorbed into your home or your business. And this can also help you save money on your air conditioning bills. Even better than a white roof would be a green roof. Green roofs have various co-benefits, including providing shade, reducing energy use, and cleaning the air and water. In urban environments, not only green roofs, but anywhere we can add green spaces is helpful. Native plants, trees, gardens are all important for mitigating heat and providing many other environmental and health benefits, including pollinator habitats and other natural resource protections. Solar can also provide similar benefits by reflecting and absorbing a lot of the thermal energy from the sun, and to provide shade for a building, a home, or a sidewalk, or another space, and produce the energy to help offset our electricity bills. According to a study by researchers at UC San Diego, solar panels reduce the amount of heat reaching the roof by 38%, keeping a building's roof 5 degrees cooler than the portions of the roof exposed to sunlight directly. So you can kind of see how, if we're taking these impacts and looking at things building by building or space by space, we can collectively have a bigger impact and an impact on our own spaces, but a bigger impact collectively over time. So these are just a few examples. And now Tobin and I will share a couple of specific examples of projects that our local governments are doing that help protect the community from heat. So here on this slide, you see some pictures of Raleigh projects. This colorful picture was taken with a heat sensing FLIR camera this summer on our heat mapping day at Chavis Park Community Center. Not only are community centers fun places to go to interact with your neighbors, they're usually attached to parks and green spaces that are great places to go to cool off, get in some air conditioning inside if you'd like. And you can also see the outline of kids playing in the splash pad at Chavis Community Center. The wet areas are a lot cooler than the hot pavement. The bottom left picture is a great view of downtown Raleigh, and you can see on the roof of the convention center, this is a white roof and it's covered in 2,000 solar panels. This is a 5,000 kilowatt solar array, and it's the second largest convention center solar array in the US. The solar panels produce the amount of energy equal to the annual energy use of 100 North Carolina homes. So the picture in the middle is of a truck applying a new pavement technology to roads that we've been piloting here in Raleigh. Raleigh's transportation department just recently won a Clean Tech Impact Award for this cool pavement pilot project. This technology will remediate pollution, address water pollutant issues, reduce urban heat island effect, and preserve pavements by adding titanium dioxide to asphalt. As the project was completed, treated roads showed a 37% reduction in nitrogen oxides, which are a type of roadway contaminant, and an average solar reflective index of 38.2, which is nearly 400% improvement over the untreated locations. So these results fostered a relationship between the city and our global Cool Cities Alliance. And there's a Cool Roadways program, which has created more pilot projects in different municipalities throughout the country. And we'd like to continue to look at this mapping data and think about where else we can start to apply this pavement over time. So the last three pictures on the right are of green stormwater infrastructure, or you'll hear a lot GSI. The top picture is of green roof at Raleigh Union Station. This collects rain. It's a type of planted roof that helps us reduce pollution to a stream called Rocky Branch, which is very impacted, and as well as to help us mitigate heat in that area. The middle picture is of Sandy Forks Road, which has 3 bioretention basins, including one in the median here. These bioretention areas manage the flow of stormwater and remove water pollution coming from a road before it reaches the storm drains and streams. And it also is a great way to mitigate heat on our roads, where many folks are also walking and biking or living nearby. The last is of a recently completed bioretention area on Glenwood and St. Mary Street. This area is engineered to capture and absorb and clean stormwater runoff when it rains. The plants, the mulch, the soil, the gravel, and the underground pipes work together to slow down the water and filter out pollution before it reaches Crabtree Creek, which is a very impacted area as well, and which floods and has a lot of heat issues as well. So our stormwater department is looking forward to working with us using the heat mapping data to prioritize and look at where we continue to add green spaces to areas that are most affected by urban heat. So with that, I'll pass it over to Tobin to share a few more examples from Durham County.
Thank you, Megan. Really great work going on in Raleigh. Always wonderful to hear about it. Some great things are happening in Durham as well. You'll see on this slide over in the top right and bottom right corners, pictures of our beautiful brand new main library. If you haven't gone to check it out yet, I encourage that you do. It's a wonderful facility and also has really wonderful green roofs on it and light covered surfaces. You can see from this picture that unlike a typical large urban building, it's really trying to build that green space into the facility, providing shade, providing cooling and native habitat. So we really tried to work that in on the roof and as well into the landscaping. Also, I will say that the libraries act as cooling centers. So the county does run a white flag program and many shelters in the area, as well as our libraries and some of the city's facilities also act as places that people can go on really hot days just to stay cool. And that's really important for people who either don't have cooling available to them or can't afford it in their homes. We also have been doing a lot of tree planting. That's in partnership with the city of Durham, Keep Durham Beautiful, Trees Durham, some wonderful organizations. And particularly have a focus on planting trees at our schools. We've planted over 2,000 trees at our public schools and continue to do more each year. And the city has a urban forestry plan that specifically calls for planting in areas that were redlined before. We saw that map that Miley showed that traditionally had not had trees in them or street trees in them because they were under resourced due to historical racism. And so really an effort to make up for that and provide those trees. The city also has a program, Green Infrastructure, $6 million specifically for reparations. And within that is a large chunk that's for green infrastructure, particularly in Black neighborhoods and under-resourced neighborhoods. The map in the middle with all the dots all over it is an example of land use planning and zoning, and Durham is currently updating our comprehensive plan in a huge effort with a lot of community engagement. I hope many of you on this call are participating in that. And that it really is weaving climate concerns throughout the comp plan. So both that mitigation, where we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases, but also the mitigation. So, or the adaptation. So how can we design our community in a way that would reduce the impacts of climate change, such as heat? And so again, that's ongoing and lots of opportunities for people to get involved in that. Go to engagedurham.org, I believe, and you can find out more about that. I do want to mention that Durham County every 3 years puts together a community health assessment. And this time around, for the very first time, we included an entire chapter on climate change, the impacts of climate change on human health. As far as we know, it's the only community health assessment in North Carolina and one of very few across the country that includes climate change at this point. There is a chapter on Urban Heat Island, and we can put the links to that in the Q&A if people are interested. And there are some recommendations in that, but there's certainly, as we mentioned, much more work to be done through conversation. So when we update that again in a few years, we'll have more information and we'll have a lot more ideas, I hope. One of the ideas that's in there right now is this idea of a basic cooling regulation, where right now it's required for landlords to provide a basic level of heat, but it's not required that they provide cooling. And so that's something we're looking into changing. Next slide, please. So next steps, we are going to continue to refine the data to make the maps as accurate and user-friendly as possible. So there's still more data to be combed through, and then understanding how people want to use this data. It will all be available through the Open Durham portal, as well as through the city and through the state climate office. So people can go in and hack to their heart's content, but also for people who maybe aren't used to using this kind of data, making it accessible to them so that they can still understand it and use it. We also want to make sure that we're not looking at this in a vacuum. So we're overlaying information on who's living here, who's working here, who's playing here, who's being transported here, at what times of days, at what level, what are their income levels, what is their energy burden, how much are they currently spending on energy relative to their income, so that even if they had an air conditioner, they can't afford to pay for it. How does that fit in with emergency room calls through our EMS and people being transported or having emergency calls on hot days? All of this information laid over each other really will tell us where do we need to focus some of our solutions and how those solutions should be different in different parts of our communities. working with departments. There are many different departments within the counties, within the cities, within other agencies, and also working with the community, with interest groups, with all you volunteers, with really all the community associations, neighborhood associations, on what does this look like? What does this feel like to you in your community? And what is it that we want to do about it? And then where are the resources to make that happen? And finally, launching an education and outreach. So letting people even know about this and why it is a problem. It's often called a silent killer because you don't see big wind or rain or clouds coming at you, but it can really, it does kill more people than any other climate related problem every year. So making sure people know about it, making sure how they can protect themselves, and then also what they can do to make things a little cooler. And again, it's not going to just be us, it's up to all of us together. So we encourage you to join us in this effort. And I believe that's our last slide. And now I think we're ready for some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Megan and Tobin. Yeah, some great questions have come in through the chat. The ones that will take a few minutes to sort of answer IRL are probably ones that are going to be more broadly applicable to the very, very big group of people that's here with us tonight. So keep putting questions into the Q&A. I also want to acknowledge that there are far more of y'all with far more questions than we have time to actually answer this evening, which is a great reason why I'm excited that folks have shared some of their contact information so that these conversations can continue beyond this evening, which feels like an important piece of this webinar. One question that I had that I think is perhaps most centrally relevant to Miley and Vivek is about the time between the differences in time over the time of day. Why do we see increasing or decreasing temperature differentials throughout different parts of the day in Raleigh and Durham?
Miley, you want to take that? I'm happy to try as well.
You can if you want, or I can give it a shot and then.
Yeah, I'll just frame it up real quick. Is just the idea that you saw the early morning temperatures in certain areas different than in the evening. And what, Max, your question is getting at largely is what's on the ground, which, as Megan and Tobin are getting to, we have some control over what we do with those landscapes. And so in those highly built out areas, all that solar radiation that's been coming down throughout the day has absorbed in those locations. And it's so dense that through the night, as outside temperatures cool, all that dense asphalt and building materials, they're trying to let all of that heat go through the night as the outside temperatures drop. And by the morning, by 6 a.m., when you go out and do another campaign or do the first run of the campaign, what the sensors pick up is the fact that those buildings and that asphalt is they're still trying to let go of a lot of that heat. And so as the day warms up, other areas start to accumulate that sun solar radiation as well. And so really kind of seeing the change from the morning to the afternoon because of all of that heat being dissipated by those built up environments early in the morning, and then it being absorbed by the other places that have a lot of asphalt or other built materials that retain that heat. I hope that made sense.
It does. Thanks, Vivek. Thanks, Miley. We had another couple of really good questions around what data remains to be analyzed. So a lot of the models and the stuff that you're seeing here is the biking and driving monitors. There is still a great deal of data that remains to be analyzed that is from our walking data, which is from a different methodology. Like I said in the beginning, one takeaway, one learning outcome I hope you have after this is that science, again, is always a work in progress, and it's always done by people. In this case, there remains more science to actually be done, and some of the people that we hope will do it are you all. What I have up here on the screen while more questions come in are more opportunities to get engaged with this work over the next couple of months. On the 16th of this month, our local Our Ladies chapter is hosting a hackathon event for walking sensor data that is open to women and to non-binary people. They'll be doing hacking local data about urban heat islands. I will also put into the chat on the 24th, Chapel Hill also ran a walking sensor data campaign, and that webinar to go over their results is on the 24th of this month. Later on, Raleigh and Durham will also host some education and further deep dives into some of the data from both of the cities that are more specific to their local areas. There's also an exciting collaborative project between UNC, Museum of Life and Science, and Durham Public Schools that will engage high school students in doing some of this work. And then as part of the North Carolina Science Festival, there will also be a large-scale hackathon for these data because there are so many intersecting pieces that remain to be sort of looked at. And today is truly only the beginning of grappling with our understanding of urban heat islands. I'll go ahead and put those links into the chat here. There are some really excellent questions there in the chat. It looks like folks are doing a really thoughtful job of responding to many of these. Are there any questions that speak to any of the panelists, perhaps as we think about closing this webinar out, that they'd like to respond to live? My last question would be for folks to share contact information into the chat as you feel available for other follow-up questions. Remembering that today, one of the central goals is to indeed show that the data is available and show where you can find it. So that's another thing that I have for our panelists is please put into the chat where some of these data can actually be found now. When folks have more questions or input that they'd like to have, it would be great to have a place for people to send them. So that's the chat is a good place for that. I have a few closing remarks while folks continue to work through the chat there. This may seem a bit out of place to talk about on a webinar sharing results that have to do with physics and climate models, but resilience to the inequitable public health issue of extreme heat requires we also look outside of what we might usually define as infrastructure resilience. This compounding climate stressor piles onto and makes more glaring the stark inequities that put us in this situation in the first place. Grappling with heat will require us to think about building better social safety measures, providing much needed healthcare to people without it, educating ourselves, our children, and others, and rapidly reducing and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. If you, like me, are troubled or challenged by the implications of what these data seem to show, I'd really like to end with a note of hope. On the eve of IPCC's second working group report, which is due later in February, I thought I'd return to what I think is the most important takeaway of the first working group's report from last year, and it's this. Human actions still have the potential to determine the future course of climate. This is not just true for climate. What we do with this new knowledge about urban heat islands will also have the potential to determine the futures of Raleigh and Durham. As an educator myself, I also want to say that public education of both adults and children is a vitally important way that we combat climate change and solve some of the issues related to urban heat islands. Science has played a role in perpetuating the marginalization of systemically excluded communities. As inheritors of that legacy, it's our responsibility to work to bridge that gap. At odds with its history, the ideal nature of science is necessarily democratic, requiring peer review, access, and replicability, diverse perspectives to give us a better understanding of our shared world. Equitable, inclusive, and accessible science, like what you're seeing this evening, is crucial to our continued survival as a human species. We have to continue to empower and rely upon everyone in our communities as we face our indispensably connected future together. I will finish up with this thought. Ultimately, if when a heat wave comes along, you're not concerned with the potential hazard or lethality for yourself, for your neighbors, for your loved ones, that's likely at least in part because you are buffered and protected from that heat by wealth. And if you're a white person like me, at least some of that wealth is generational, inherited, or otherwise unearned. Considering extreme heat resilience is an important inflection point for a city to also consider how to move forward equitably. Again, keeping in mind that extreme heat is more than just a climate or physical phenomenon. It's also tied into important social, economic, public health, and environmental policy and planning interventions that directly intersect with climate risk. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Imani to close out the evening.
Thank you. So thank you to all the panelists tonight. The data is available and accessible to the public. A link will be put into the chat for you to reach it directly right here and now and to use for later on. We have faith in this being useful to people, and we are open to always meeting with groups and individuals, et cetera, to discuss data more in depth than what we have tonight. Once again, a huge thank you to the residents of Durham Raleigh area. Everything presented tonight is all thanks to you, so we can't say thank you enough. Please remember, science is a never-ending process, and this is not the end-all be-all of this project. So please do not walk away tonight feeling defeated or unheard. Please do reach out. We do want to hear your questions and concerns. And so thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And that is all.